On the 63rd day alone, Harold Winters walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down at the rocks below. The fall would take less than 2 seconds. The water was cold enough to kill a man in minutes, but he would likely die on impact. It would be quick. It would be easy. He stood there for a long time, the wind tearing at his coat, the gray sea churning beneath him. Then he turned around and walked back to the lighthouse. He did not write about this moment in his logbook. He did not explain why he chose to keep living. He simply recorded the weather, the condition of the beacon, and the number of rations remaining. The next entry reads, Day 64, wind from the northwest, light snow, beacon operational. As if nothing had happened, as if the decision to continue existing required no further comment. This is the story of how Harold Winters came to stand on that cliff, and what happened in the 89 days between the death of his partner and the arrival of the supply ship that would finally take him home. The Pribilof Islands lie in the Bering Sea, approximately 300 miles west of mainland Alaska. They are among the most isolated inhabited places in the Northern Hemisphere.
St. Paul Island is the largest of the Pribilofs, but that is not saying much. It is a treeless volcanic rock, roughly 14 miles long, surrounded by some of the most dangerous waters in the world. In 1954, the lighthouse there was one of the last manned stations in the Alaska Territory. 2 keepers were assigned to each winter rotation, a redundancy built into the system for exactly the kind of emergency that would soon occur. Harold Winters had served in the Lighthouse Service for over 20 years. He was a quiet man, methodical, comfortable with isolation. He had requested the Pribilof assignment specifically because it offered solitude. His partner for the winter was Eugene Takak, a 34-year-old Aleut man from the village of St. Paul on the other side of the island. Takak knew the island better than anyone. He had grown up there, hunting seals and fishing the surrounding waters before joining the Lighthouse Service. The 2 men arrived at the station in early October, relieving the summer crew. The supply ship would not return until late February. For nearly 5 months, they would be entirely on their own. The first weeks passed without incident. They fell into a rhythm, maintaining the beacon, monitoring the weather, sharing meals, trading occasional conversation.
In late November, something changed. Takak began complaining of fatigue and shortness of breath. He dismissed it at first. The cold, the heavy work, perhaps a mild illness that would pass. Winters noticed his partner moving more slowly, resting more often, his face taking on a grayish pallor. He suggested Takak stay inside and rest while he handled the outdoor duties alone. Takak agreed, which worried Winters more than anything. The younger man was not the type to accept help easily. On the morning of November 28th, Winters woke to find Takak still in his bed, unresponsive. His breathing was shallow and labored. His skin was cold and damp. Winters tried everything he knew, elevating his legs, keeping him warm, forcing small sips of water between his lips. Nothing helped. By noon, Takak's breathing had become irregular, stopping and starting in long, agonizing intervals. At 2:47 in the afternoon, according to the logbook, Eugene Takak died. Winters sat beside the body for a long time. He did not know what to do. There was no protocol for this. No training had prepared him for the reality of being alone with a dead man on a rock in the middle of the Bering Sea.
The first thing Winters did was try the radio. He needed to report the death, to request an emergency evacuation, to hear another human voice. He turned the dials, adjusted the frequency, pressed the transmit button. Nothing. Static. He checked the connections, traced the wiring, climbed to the roof to inspect the antenna. A section of the array had been torn loose. Storm damage, probably from the gale that had passed through 2 weeks earlier. He had not noticed it because Takak had been handling the radio checks. Now, standing on the roof in the freezing wind, staring at the dangling cable, Winters understood the full scope of his situation. He was alone. The radio was dead. No ship would come for nearly 3 months. No one on the mainland knew anything was wrong. He climbed back down and stood in the doorway of the living quarters, looking at the body of his partner. The cold would preserve it for a while, but not indefinitely. He could not leave it inside.
The thought of sharing his living space with a corpse for the entire winter was unbearable. He would have to bury him. The ground outside was already freezing, and within weeks it would be frozen solid. If he was going to dig a grave, he had to do it now.
It took Winters 2 days to dig the grave. The ground was rocky and half frozen, yielding only inches at a time. His hands blistered, then bled, then blistered again. He worked in shifts, digging until he could no longer feel his fingers, then retreating inside to warm himself by the stove before going back out. The hole did not need to be deep. There were no predators on the island large enough to disturb a body. 4 feet would suffice. When it was done, he wrapped Takak's body in a canvas tarp and carried him outside. The younger man had been slight, but death had made him heavier somehow, or perhaps Winters was simply exhausted. He lowered the body into the grave as gently as he could, then stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. He was not a religious man. He had no prayers memorized, no scripture to recite. In the end, he said only, "You deserved better than this." Then he filled in the hole, piling rocks on top to mark the spot. He carved Takak's name and the date into a piece of driftwood and drove it into the ground at the head of the grave. Then he walked back to the lighthouse, closed the door behind him, and sat down in the silence. He was alone now. Completely alone.
The first week alone was the hardest. The silence was oppressive, a physical presence that filled every corner of the lighthouse. Winters found himself talking aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was only his own. He narrated his actions as he performed them. He argued with himself about trivial decisions. Once, he caught himself having a full conversation with Takak's empty chair. He stopped, stared at the chair, and did not speak again for 2 days. The routine of lighthouse keeping saved him. The beacon had to be maintained, the fuel had to be checked, the weather had to be recorded, the logbook had to be filled. These tasks gave structure to days that would otherwise have dissolved into shapeless gray hours. He clung to them like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. Every morning he woke at the same time. Every evening he lit the beacon at the same time. Every night he wound the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens. The routine became ritual, and ritual became survival. Without it, he knew, the silence would swallow him whole. He rationed his food carefully. The supplies had been calculated for 2 men over 5 months. With only 1 mouth to feed, he had enough, barely. But he could not afford waste, could not afford miscalculation.
The winter storms came in December, winds that screamed across the island at 70 miles per hour. Waves that crashed against the cliffs with enough force to shake the lighthouse itself. Winters would lie awake at night listening to the structure groan, wondering if this would be the storm that finally tore it apart. During the worst gales, he could not go outside at all. He would sit by the window, watching the horizontal rain, the sea churning light, the world reduced to a few dozen yards of visibility. The isolation deepened. Days passed without variation. He began losing track of time, forgetting what day it was, sometimes what month. The logbook became his anchor to reality. As long as he kept writing, he knew he was still alive. He wrote about the weather. He wrote about the beacon. He wrote about his dwindling food supplies. And sometimes, late at night, he wrote about other things, memories from his childhood, places he had visited, people he had known. He wrote about his wife, who had died 6 years earlier. He wrote about the son who had stopped speaking to him after she passed. He wrote as if someone might one day read these words and understand what it had been like to be utterly alone at the edge of the world.
By January, the food was running low. Winters had rationed carefully, but careful rationing could only stretch supplies so far. He was down to 1 small meal a day. A few spoonfuls of canned meat, some hardtack biscuits, a cup of weak tea. His body was consuming itself. His clothes hung loose on his frame. His face in the small shaving mirror had become unrecognizable, gaunt, hollow-eyed, the face of a man being slowly erased. He tried fishing from the rocks when the weather permitted, but the winter seas were too violent. the fish too deep. He found some seaweed along the shoreline and forced himself to eat it, though his stomach rebelled at the taste. He caught a single gull that had been injured by the wind and been unable to fly. He killed it quickly, feeling a strange guilt, then roasted it over the stove. It was the first fresh meat he had eaten in weeks. He dreamed about food constantly. Elaborate meals he had eaten decades ago. Dishes his mother had prepared. The smell of bread baking in a warm kitchen. He would wake with his mouth watering and his stomach clenching, then lie in the darkness, waiting for dawn so he could begin the routine again. The routine was all that remained. The routine and the beacon.
On the 63rd day, he walked to the cliff. He stood there, looking down at the rocks, feeling the wind tear at him, and he made a decision. He chose to live. He did not know why. There was no logical reason to continue. No one was coming. No one knew he was alive. The food would run out before the supply ship arrived. He was gone to die on this rock. Alone, forgotten, and nothing he did in the remaining weeks would change that. And yet, he turned around. He walked back to the lighthouse. He lit the beacon. He wrote in the logbook. He ate his meager ration of canned meat and hardtack. He did not die that day, or the next, or the day after that. Something in him simply refused to stop. The days that followed were the darkest. He moved through them like a ghost, performing his duties without thought, speaking to no one, eating almost nothing. He stopped looking in the mirror. He stopped caring about his appearance or his hygiene. He existed only to maintain the beacon, that single point of light, sweeping across the darkness, warning ships away from the rocks, serving a purpose, even if he no longer felt he served any purpose at all.
On February 21st, 1955, the supply ship appeared on the horizon. Winters saw it from the lighthouse tower, a dark shape against the gray morning sky, growing slowly larger. He did not believe it at first. He had imagined ships before, seen them in the distance, only to watch them dissolve into fog or memory. But this one kept coming. It anchored offshore, and a small boat was lowered. He watched men row toward the island, their voices carrying across the water. He walked down to the rocks to meet them. He could not speak. When the first man reached him and asked if he was all right, Winters simply pointed toward the grave on the hill. The rescue crew found a man who had lost nearly 40 pounds, who had not spoken to another human being in 89 days, who had kept a lighthouse beacon burning through the darkest months of an Arctic winter, entirely alone. They found a logbook filled with meticulous daily entries, weather, beacon status, rations remaining, alongside scattered pages of something more personal, more fragmented, written in a shaking hand. They found a grave marked with driftwood, the name Eugene Takak carved into the wood. Harold Winters was evacuated to the mainland and hospitalized for malnutrition and psychological distress. He never returned to Lighthouse Service. He lived quietly in Anchorage for the remaining 18 years of his life, working as a watchman at a cannery, rarely speaking of what had happened on St. Paul Island. When he died in 1973, his personal effects included a single item from his time in the Pribilofs, a small photograph of Eugene Takak, kept in his wallet, worn smooth from years of handling. The lighthouse on St. Paul Island was automated in 1962. No keeper has lived there since. The beacon still turns, sweeping its light across the empty sea, warning ships away from the rocks, just as it did through those 89 days, when a man refused to let it go dark, even when there was no reason left to keep it burning.